guys, it's me. I'm here today to talk about Bryan Singer's first X-Men movie that came out in the year 2000, 20 years ago, starring Hugh Jackman, Famke Janssen, James Marsden, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and so many other people that it's impossible to name every single one off the bat. This cast is incredibly huge. Talking about movies that hit their anniversary mark is becoming a bit of a trend for me lately. This movie is now 20 years old. Ooh. This movie was a bit of a unique experience for me as far as watching it for the first time, because at the time of this movie's release, I was 10 years old. I never got around to watching any of the X-Men movies, so I didn't see this in theaters. I saw this about 7 years ago when I was 23. The trailer for Days of Future Past came out at the time, and I was really intrigued by it, but then I realized I've never seen any of the X-Men movies, so I probably should do my homework. So leading up to Days of Future Past, I took the time to watch the X-Men movies. And considering how the superhero genre was changing a little bit 7 years back, on the first watch, I was actually quite impressed with this. And watching it last night to prepare for this review, I'd say my verdict is more or less the same. Pretty good, but some things that drag it down a little bit, which we'll talk about as we go along. Now, as far as my experience with the X-Men series or X-Men comics, I've never read any of the comics. Obviously, I've seen the movies, well, most of them at least. But I would consider myself like a casual fan of the series, and I like the core themes that the X-Men's all about, such as prejudice, racism, and conflicting ideologies. The latter of which being between Charles Xavier and his arch-nemesis and friend, Erik Lehnsherr, also known as Magneto. The X-Men comics started off in the early 60s, right at the height of the civil rights movement. And even today, it's still very much relevant when you see various different types of prejudices and racism. And through characters like Senator Kelly, they touch on the fears of the unknown, advocating that the mutants have to self-register with the government in order to be well known to the public, so they can potentially see who's a threat and who's not. And we'll get to this later on, but it also really excels at its characterization and casting, as well as the action sequences that show up in the climactic battle. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know this, but for those of you who don't, this movie was a huge game changer for the comic book movie genre back in the year 2000. At that time, 20 years ago, the genre was in a very, very different state of mind back then. As far as comic book movies that were really successful financially and critically, you had Superman, you had Batman, and the first Blade was considered a success, but nowhere near to those levels that we saw with Christopher Reeve and Michael Keaton. Everything else, though, not so much, particularly the latter two Batman movies that showed up in the late 90s. But this was the first comic book movie at that time that was able to show not just comic book fans, but the general audiences that, oh, okay, like comic book movies can be legitimately good. And then 2 years later, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man comes out and propelled the genre to even greater heights. X-Men was the quarterback who threw the ball. Spider-Man was the receiver who caught it in the end zone for the touchdown. And considering how really campy a lot of the comic book movies were at that time, this was the first comic book movie, aside from Blade and also the Christopher Reeve Superman, where comic book films can be taken really seriously, with moments of humor sprinkled throughout. Now, since I mentioned that, this movie has gotten criticized in many regards, especially in recent years as far as retroactive criticism. People tend to look at this movie, as well as the first two Spider-Man movies in particular, which I've talked about that in depth in other videos, but this one and its sequel, they tend to get criticized from the perspective of how the genre is today, and I don't really think that's fair to look at that, because one of many criticisms that I've heard is that this movie takes itself too seriously and that it's not really comic book inspired, because the costumes, for one, are black leather and not the colorful costumes that we know from the comics and from the 90s show that was really popular at that time. And also, the characterization of Rogue doesn't really sit well with people. She's more timid and very emotional, as opposed to the sassy Southern girl that a lot of people gravitate towards. And then there's also the overuse of Wolverine, but that's a common thing that we see in the other X-Men movies, as I'm sure a lot of you know. Now, I understand why that they went the direction that they did as far as a more mature tone. And while, yeah, it would have been cool to go for a more comic book inspired tone, but I think that you have to watch this with a bit of historical perspective, because, as I mentioned earlier, this was a huge game changer for the genre at that time. Considering where the superhero genre was at that point, this movie's creative choices were necessary for where the genre was, and it had to put the genre back on track. Could you say that it's a little too serious for its own good sometimes? Maybe for some people. It really depends on your views as a person, but for myself, I don't think so. There's enough humanity and levity for me to make it worthwhile, particularly moments like this. Security. or this.
Hey, it's me.
Prove it.
You're a dick.
Okay.
And now that I mention that, whatever your thoughts are on this movie and its sequel, you cannot deny that the strongest point that this movie's got to offer is the casting and the characterizations. Every single actor, well, except for maybe Halle Berry, which we'll talk about later, they are inspired choices. Patrick Stewart as Charles Xavier, Ian McKellen as Magneto, James Marsden as Cyclops, Famke Janssen as Jean Grey, Anna Paquin as Rogue, Shawn Ashmore as Iceman, and of course, the man, the myth, the legend, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. His whole introduction, when we see him in that cage fight and him going up against the bartender cutting off his shotgun, that is one of the greatest introductions that I've ever seen to a character in a comic book movie. Now, we all know in the years since then that Hugh Jackman has proved himself to be an excellent actor. I apologize for the pun, but in this movie and the following sequels that came after that, he absolutely nails this character. Now, I don't know the X-Men comics, but from the little bits of research that I've done and seeing other interpretations in the various clips of X-Men shows that I've seen, well, the clips that I've watched on YouTube at least, Hugh Jackman is just on point, no question about it. Even those X-Men fans who got tired of him being overused in these movies, they cannot deny that this guy's really good at it. And this movie makes a really wise choice of making him the main protagonist of the story, as well as Rogue. I would consider them dual protagonists in this film. They're both loners, they're both misunderstood by the people around them, and they're thrown into this crazy world where they see all these mutant powers, and us as the audience through these two characters obviously want to know, what's the deal with all these mutant powers? Where do they come from? What's their place in life? Getting introduced to all these different mutants with all their different types of powers through Charles Xavier's school, or the School for Gifted Youngsters. Seeing Charles Xavier use Cerebro to try to hunt down his friend Magneto, and him and Magneto clashing with each other on how they should coexist with the human race, or should they just wipe them out from existence. Magneto in this film, played by Ian McKellen, oh my god, he is absolutely fantastic. There's nobody else you could have chosen better to play this character. I love Michael Fassbender as a younger Magneto, but as far as the older Magneto, Ian McKellen, hands down. And his motivations for being a villain, you completely understand where this guy's coming from. After experiencing persecution as a young boy for being a mutant in the middle of World War II, that scene is heartbreaking, and I think it's a perfect summation of why Eric Lenscher is the way he is. Ever since then, for him, the war's never been over, and he has this intense hatred towards humans that he just simply can't let go of. Charles Xavier, on the other hand, is aware of the hatred towards mutants, but he obviously doesn't want to wipe them out. He wants to find a way to coexist with them. And obviously, people have pointed this out. Charles Xavier, in a lot of ways, is like Martin Luther King. Magneto is like Malcolm X. They both want to find their own place in society. They just have different ways of going about it. And the hero-villain dynamic / friendship that's portrayed in this movie and in the following sequels, no surprise coming from me, but it is so well portrayed. And not just his reasons for hating humankind, but what he wants to do. He wants other humans to feel not only his pain, but the pain that other mutants have on the receiving end of prejudice that they get from human beings. As they show when he infects Senator Kelly with the mutant gene and he later ends up dying because of it. And in order to do that, he needs to harness that power through his machine by using Rogue, who's able to steal someone's life force by physically touching them. Speaking of Rogue, played by Anna Paquin, who actually is an Oscar award-winning actress, I might add. A lot of people don't like the portrayal of Rogue in this one, as I said earlier. They prefer the confident Southern babe from the comics and from the shows. I get the appeal, and it would be really cool to get those things, but considering where she is at this point in the series, I think it makes perfect sense for her to be kind of like really unsure of herself and very emotional, and she's a teenager. Teenagers tend to be really emotional people, let's be honest, especially when they hit puberty. And when she sucks the life force out of that poor boy that she was actually having a love affair with, and her trying to find her place in life, wondering like, where does she fit in all this? I think it feels perfectly natural, and I think to this day, Bryan Singer still stands by this creative choice. And if it makes sense in the story, you know what? Good for him. And Bryan Singer also does a really good job of directing this movie. There's a really good sense of energy that he puts throughout this film. The film feels very small, obviously considering the time period that this came out in, but there's a good sense of energy in there too. And for the time, I think the action scenes are very well filmed. Some of it looks a little bit obvious that they're stunt doubles, and it's very late 90s, early 2000s-esque, particularly this shot when Mystique kicks Wolverine in the face. Not great, but again, considering the time period, I think it's fine. And Magneto's henchmen like Mystique, Sabretooth, and Toad, they're all really fun, and even though there's not a whole lot of dimension to them, Mystique is really edgy in this one. And to be honest with you guys, I actually kind of prefer this version of Mystique over Jennifer Lawrence. I know, that's kind of a shock, because you guys know how much I love J-Law. We'll get to that at a later time, but I think in this series, minus X-Men Days of Future Past, I think Mystique is best used in the original series. Now, as far as the problems go, there's not a whole lot of time to all the characters that we get to introduce to. Now, this is an introduction. I understand you can't focus on every single person, and they were kind of in uncharted territory with this one. This is like the first team-up movie that we ever saw in a superhero film, until 12 years later with the first Avengers movie. I'm okay with Rogue and Wolverine being the lead protagonists of the film, and I do like seeing their progression and how they form a common bond with each other. Unfortunately, Cyclops and Jean Grey, they're not really given a whole lot to do. The actors are really well cast, and I think they do a good job with what they're given, and I kind of like seeing the interactions between Jean Grey and Logan. But as far as the attempt to establish a romantic connection between Logan and Jean, I'm not really buying that. I mean, there's barely an attempt to give them some kind of chemistry. Towards the end of the movie, there seems to be all of a sudden this romantic interest on her end. Yeah, no, you lost me. James Marsden as Cyclops, I really would have liked to have seen more of him, because from what we see, he is really good. I like the moment when he smiles at the young boy at the train station. Apparently, I read this little tidbit online that young boy was a big X-Men fan, and that when he saw James Marsden, he just couldn't take his eyes off of him. It was like, oh my god, it's Cyclops, and he just kept smiling, and then when James Marsden saw him, he smiled back, because, I mean, come on, could you resist that little boy? I couldn't. In the scene where Scott tells Logan to stay away from Jean, there's actually an extended version of that scene where it gives Cyclops a bit of more dimension and gives us more of a reason as to why he and Logan don't like each other so much.
Have you ever seen real combat, boy?
Have you? Don't like to talk about your past?
Not to you.
Well, it must just kill you that a boy like me saved your life. You gotta be careful. I might not be there next time.
It's not a big deal for me, but I would have liked to have seen that. Then you have Halle Berry as Storm. Okay, in all seriousness, Halle Berry is a fine actress. I got nothing against her. As far as I can tell, she looks like a really nice woman. Not to mention she's really nice to look at. But her performance is not on the same level as the others.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
That being said, I'd rather watch her as Storm over her as Catwoman. And then there's also the musical score by Michael Kamen. I'm not a fan. Well, mostly it's the main theme. It's not really that great. But there are parts of the score that I like, particularly the piece where Logan manages to save Rogue on the top of the Statue of Liberty. By the way, that moment when Rogue gets the white streak in her hair, that was a nice touch. But all in all though, this movie still has a really good intention behind it. It wants to pay respect to the X-Men comics while telling its own story, giving its own unique portrayal of the characters. It's not like it's trying to give a middle finger to the audience or anything, which unfortunately I've seen that complaint one too many times from comic book fans over the years with certain movies, and there's really no need to go into that. But anyway, and another thing that I really like about this movie, and something that I noticed last night, in regards to its themes on prejudice and racism, this movie doesn't really preach. There's not that one moment where a character goes on this big speech about how they're misunderstood by the public and how they need to do better, they need to do X, Y, and Z. It doesn't go on a soapbox about that kind of stuff. It's a subtle exploration of those ideologies, and I think it's best showcased in the dynamic between Xavier and Magneto. So all in all, I would say the first X-Men is a really good movie. Not a great one necessarily, but I would say in the context of the series, it's a really good start to the franchise. If you were to view this on its own as a standalone movie, you would probably look at it and go, it's not that great. I get where that comes from, but I have to keep emphasizing this. You have to look at this from the perspective of the time period that it came out in. And at that time, it was a huge game changer for the superhero genre. Those are my thoughts on the first X-Men movie. If my speech sounds a bit slurred, I apologize. I had my wisdom teeth pulled out last week. It's been a really rocky week. Thankfully, I've been getting better as the days have gone on. I've been taking a lot of medicine, which has been really helpful. Staying hydrated and trying to eat soft foods and slowly easing my way back into chewy, crunchy foods. So thank you guys for bearing with me as I powered through this. It was not easy, but I managed to get through it, so we're all good. So thanks again, guys, for watching my video. What are your thoughts on the first X-Men movie? Do you love it, like it, think it's alright, or do you hate it? Whatever the case is, comment below and tell me your thoughts, and I'll see you all very soon.